Welcome to our fly control webinar. So before we dive in, Eliza and myself, we're here to help with any questions that you might have. We're here today to share a bit of basic knowledge about flies and how to combat them, so that you can help your customers when you're faced with these questions. Now, unfortunately, we can't hear you. We also can't see you. However, if I can flip through the slides, there we go. However, there is a function on the webinar to ask questions. Now, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to see these as we go along. However, please do drop your questions in there. And if there's a bit of time at the end, we'll be able to answer them at the end of the webinar. If not, then I'll be sure to get back to everybody with an email. There's also emojis along the way, so please do react if things make sense or you like something, then just use that emoji button to react to the content. So again, welcome to the Lodi's Agricultural Fly Control. Looking at a bit about what we're going to cover today, we've got some fly facts, a bit about the types of flies that we look after, the life cycle, reasons why we control them, and then how we control them. And then moving on to some of Lodi's solutions, why choose Lodi to work with for your pest control, and the marketing support that we offer. So diving straight in with some key fly facts. So female flies can lay up to 500 eggs in their lifetime. They'll lay these in batches of around 75 to 150 at a time. The amount that a fly can lay actually depends on the size of the fly, and that starts at the larval stage and the nutrition that they get. That it's also very much temperature dependent. Another fact, houseflies find sugar with their feet. So unfortunately, they've got a very wide range of food that they eat. So they may be landing on feces, they may be landing on your food. Hopefully it goes in the right order, but they'll dance around on the food with their feet to use them sugar receptors to see how tasty that meal is. Another fact is that houseflies have a liquid diet, so they actually don't have biting mouth parts, only sponging. So they will regurgitate the last meal onto their tasty food that they've found with the dancing feet. That projects enzymes onto the food, which starts to break it down, and they then suck up the liquids through their sponging mouth parts. Also, blowflies are the first insects that are attracted to an animal carcass following death, and coroners can actually use blowflies to determine an approximate time of death. So moving on to different types of flies. So first of all, we've got the non-biting flies. As the name suggests, these flies do not bite. They can't bite the animal. However, the way that their mouth parts are structured and their feet are structured, they are still fantastic vectors of pathogens and disease. So some of these diseases can be viruses, worms. They're very much key carriers of salmonella, and they can carry this bacteria from unit to unit or potentially from farm to farm. Looking at biting flies, so they will still transmit diseases and the worms and the viruses in the same manner with their feet. However, they've got the added benefit of being able to bite as well. So because they feed on blood, they can also cause anemia and loss of conditioning in the farm animals. Some farm animals can develop hypersensitivity to the saliva, which then causes skin conditions, and these can be really painful. Now, regardless of the type of fly, biting or non-biting, they are a big distraction to the animals, and they can actually distract them from eating, grazing or resting. Because they can't eat, graze or rest as they normally would, this has a big impact on their productivity in producing meat, milk and eggs, and that then comes at a large financial loss to the farmer. So did you know there are more than 110,000 described species of flies in the world? We're not going to go through all 110,000. We will just look at the ones that are a concern on farm. So specifically at the blowfly, so each of these species of flies have different characteristics, different breeding habits and feeding habits. So understanding these gives you a better idea of your approach to fly control. So looking at the blowfly, this is your green bottlefly, your blue bottlefly. They're attracted to carrion and decaying flesh. So they'll lay their eggs in decaying flesh, which the larvae then feed on. Blowflies tend to be a problem more so in sheep, so we get blowfly strike. So the flies lay their eggs in an open wound. The larvae then cause a reaction in the wound, which causes the sheep's flesh to continue to decay. Now, this can lead to a very poorly sheep, or in really serious cases, it can actually lead to the death of the animal. Looking at the stable fly, this is a biting fly. So stable flies only want a blood feed. These tend not to be a problem in chickens or sheep. Obviously, chickens are covered in feathers, sheep are covered in wool, so the blood feed isn't quite as easy in a chicken or a sheep. So they'll be more around the cattle, the horses, the pigs. So the stable fly will go for fleshy areas with thinner skin, so very much the ears, the legs and the underbelly. Female stable flies actually need a blood feed before they can begin to produce eggs, and their larval stage is very hardy and robust, so they're very resistant to being trampled by cattle. Looking at the common housefly, so this is a non-biting fly, so it has the sponging mouth parts. With the common housefly, it is a very fast process from egg to adult fly, and this process can happen in as little as 7 days. As we know, due to their spongy mouth parts, they'll regurgitate the last meal to liquefy the food. The common housefly flies in a very steady manner from surface to surface, so they'll quite often be found resting, sometimes on horizontal surfaces as well. They like to lay their eggs in fresh feces, and they're very much attracted to the sex pheromones in Sheila and 21. Sheila and 21 are two of our fly baits, and we'll talk more about that later. Looking at the lesser housefly, this is also a non-biting housefly. It has a slightly slower process from egg to adult in around 8 to 10 days. The lesser housefly will seek out semi-liquid matter to breed, to lay their eggs. So this can be places such as septic tanks. They're more tolerant to cooler weather, so you'll find them more prevalent in spring. And they prefer to rest on vertical surfaces and string, and they will fly from surface to surface in a very erratic motion. Now, I say surface to surface, they don't land as often as a common housefly, but they're very erratic. So quite strong characteristics between the common housefly and the lesser housefly. So before we actually look at the life cycle, a little interesting fact, a fly's life cycle becomes shorter as the temperature increases. So flies can reproduce year-round in warm conditions, but the life cycle becomes shorter as the temperature increases. So at 16 degrees Celsius, from egg to adult takes around 50 days, which decreases to only 16 days at 25 degrees and 7 days at 35 degrees. So 35 degrees is an absolute optimal temperature. This makes your poultry units and your pig housing the perfect breeding habitat for flies. So scientists have actually tried to shorten this process in fly breeding, but they've never been able to shorten the process more than that in a poultry house. So looking at the actual life cycle of a fly, so we start with egg laying. Females deposit hundreds of eggs in rotting organic matter, such as rubbish, manure, leftover food. The egg then hatches and we move on to the larval stage. So maggots hatch from the eggs, they're then feeding voraciously on decaying material. This aids in its decomposition and helps to liquefy manure. During the first 2 larval stages, they are feeding voraciously, but then during the 3rd larval stage, their feeding slows as they start to make their way to the surface of the muck to find a dry area to pupate. So this moves them on to the pupal stage. So the maggots transform into pupae within protective casings called puparium, where they undergo metamorphosis into adult flies. And then the emergence, so adult flies emerge from the pupal casing. It's quite a short-lived journey where they're focused on breeding and feeding. So the lifespan typically ranges from around a few days to a few months. Looking specifically at the larvae, so the flies lay their eggs in this organic decaying matter for a reason. That's what the larvae feed on. So they need this rotting, decaying matter to survive. And the adult flies lay their eggs where their offspring have the best chance of survival. So once the eggs hatch, which can take as little as a few hours, the larvae live in groups in the top 4 inches of the muck. So they're staying in the warmth of a group and feeding ferociously, which again aids in the liquefaction of that muck. And they'll continue to do this until they reach that 3rd larval stage. So once they reach the 3rd larval stage, the larvae start to make their way to the surface of the muck. They've needed all this warmth and this liquid organic matter to be able to feed and grow, but to become a pupae and move on to that next stage, they need somewhere dry to pupate. So they're making their way to the surface of the muck. They'll form that puparium, and then once the metamorphosis is complete, they'll then emerge as adult flies. So as adult flies, the new fly emerges from the puparium. The wings are very wet and crinkled at this point. So they wait until the wings are dried out before taking that maiden flight. A lot of the time you can see the new flies crawling up vertical surfaces to allow their wings to dry fully. So for the common housefly and the lesser housefly, their first priority is to breed, even more so than eating. For a stable fly, for a female stable fly, breeding is very close second because the female first needs a blood feed before she can begin to produce the eggs. Egg production and breeding can occur within only 48 hours of emergence. So this 2-day-old fly can then start to lay eggs in batches of up to 150 eggs at a time. So this is how your infestations can grow so rapidly out of control very quickly. So looking at reasons why we use fly control, there are many reasons. So having a good fly control program in place can spare animals a huge amount of suffering and aggravation. In the long run, it saves a lot of time, it saves money, it's increased production, increased conditioning of the animals, as well as reducing the disease. Flies are also a major nuisance and cause of stress to the animals, the farmers, the staff, and the local neighbours. So flies will quite happily migrate to neighbouring sites and residential areas to seek their ideal habitat should their original home no longer be suitable. So generally this would be due to overpopulation. Poultry and livestock farms are the ideal 5-star accommodation for breeding flies. They've got plenty of organic matter to feed on and breeding, plus they've got them ideal stable temperatures. They also cause huge financial losses on farms and to the agricultural industry. So these financial losses come in 2 forms. So first of all, fines can be imposed on farmers for insufficient fly control, but also the loss of production from animals. So due to the irritation and the distraction from the flies, this reduces their productivity. And again, the bottom line of profit for the farmers. So looking at the impact of flies, first of all, we've got animal welfare risks. So when an animal begins to, when the flies begin to cause a stress to the animals, they can expend too much energy trying to fight off the flies. They're also really distracted by the flies. So this can distract them then from eating, resting and sleeping in the way that they usually would. Also, whilst research does show that animal welfare complaints result in, very few result in prosecution, we do have a moral obligation to avoid suffering where possible. Looking at environmental complaints, environmental complaints can result in a visit from an environmental health officer. These complaints can carry much more severe consequences, including fines and prosecutions. Other reasons to take fly control seriously: they spread disease in animals. The bites are quite painful, which can put the animals off grazing, which again then results in them lower yields, causes the stress and the damage to cattle hides, and they're a nuisance to the humans as well. Nobody wants to go to work and be attacked by flies, so they are a big nuisance to the farmers and the herdsmen. Now, looking specifically at the animals, I'm not going to go too far into this because your farmers already know this. This is why they're coming to you for fly control. I can send the presentation over to you so you can look at this in more detail should you wish. But looking specifically at the pigs, pig housing is the perfect breeding site for flies. Because of the distraction and the irritation, it can lead to a 12-day increase in finishing the pigs. This 12-day increase equates to around about a 10% increase in finishing, which can cost farmers around £15,000 per 1,500 pigs in feeding, labour and housing costs. Looking at cows, so flies are a big spreader of the bacteria that causes summer mastitis. This in itself can cost around £300 per case, but also the impact of loss of productivity. Cows can lose 0.3 kilos per day in production, and also 500 mils of milk daily. So this again, just huge bottom line profit losses for the farmer. In poultry housing, now the stable flies tend not to be an issue in poultry housing because they're covered in feathers, so it's a lot harder to get that blood feed. But the way that the poultry housing is designed, if 100 flies were to go undetected, living under the slats, and each of them 100 flies deposited their 150 eggs, that's potentially 15,000 flies that just come out of the blue. So an inclusive fly control program in poultry housing is absolutely essential. Looking at the equestrian industry, now the stable flies themselves, they've got that nasty bite. They can leave the small itchy lumps on the animal. But for horses, stable flies also carry anthrax and equine infectious anemia, both of which can be fatal to horses. So now looking at how we control the flies. So one method of control is larvicides. So we employ larvicides to manage the larvae, the fly larvae, which accounts for 80% of the fly's life cycle. So it's a really important part of any fly management program. Integrating an integrated fly control approach is crucial for farms to effectively manage the fly populations. Relying solely on an adulticide can lead to rapid reinfestation of the building by the eggs, the maggots, and the pupae. Products like Lodi's maggots and larvanol, these are examples of larvicides that contain insect growth regulators. So these actives disrupt the development of the larvae. So by interrupting the development, the larvae are unable to progress to the pupal stage and die as larvae with no chance of reproduction. So we're just cutting that life cycle off completely. Flies such as the common, the lesser and the stable flies, they'll lay their egg in the organic matter. They do it for a reason, because that's what the larvae need to feed on. They need to live in that organic matter to keep the warmth. They've got the perfect moist conditions to grow and progress through the stages. A fly will lay its eggs where the larvae have the best chance of survival. So if there is an area of muck that's been treated versus an area that's untreated, the untreated area will be the optimal area. So it is really important with larvicides that we treat the whole area and nothing is missed. So after the egg has hatched, the larvae reside in the upper 4 inches of the waste material. So again, this is where they're feeding, where they're living. So it's vital that the larvicides are present in this top 4 inches of muck for effective control. In livestock housing environments where the waste is accumulating constantly, it's essential that we've got some kind of measuring device to understand when the muck has accumulated an extra 4 inches, and then we can reapply the larvicide. So larvae spend them first 2 larval stages in the warmth of the group below the surface of the muck, ferociously feeding on all this decaying matter. The third stage of the larval process, they're making their way up to the surface, they're seeking that dry place to pupate before emerging as a fly. Once they become a pupae and they're in their puparium casing, they do not eat. So the larvicides are not effective on the pupae. On the third larval stage, it will still be effective. However, their feeding habits slow down quite dramatically because they're just making their way to the surface to pupate. So the first and second larval stages are the optimal stages for larvicides. So looking at the adulticides, so these are substances or products that are designed to control the adult fly population. So this accounts for 20% of the fly's life cycle. Adulticides come in different formulations, including traps, aerosols, fogging liquids, ready-to-use trigger sprays, wettable powders, and granules. There's more. The different types of adulticides. Now, the actives themselves don't necessarily fit into one category or another. It can change between knockdown and residual depending on the carrier substance, also depending on what else it's being mixed with. So we can break them down into 2 different categories, but not necessarily by active. So looking at knockdown adulticides, so these substances, they kill flies on contact, but they have no lasting effect. So a knockdown adulticide will only work on the adults that are present at the time, but as there's no residual, if flies represent themselves, we need to reapply the treatment, go back in with the treatment again. We've then got residual adulticides, very much just as it says on the tin, it leaves a residue. So these will leave residues on surfaces which will continue to kill the flies when they come into contact with it or ingest it. And so the residual adulticides provide longer term control. However, there is a place for both because in sensitive areas, we don't want a residual effect. Importance of reading labels. Each active ingredient and formulation has specific instructions regarding its suitable usage areas. It will also tell you on the label whether it's a knockdown or a residual and what environments it's safe to use in. So it's really important that we don't just look at the active, we read and understand the label. So monitoring and identification. Monitoring fly numbers in animal housing is important for several reasons. Firstly, we're understanding when the issue is rising, and that allows the farmers to act fast and nip the problem in the bud. In some cases, environmental health officers may require evidence of monitoring. We've got fantastic products for this, such as our fly glue roll. So the glue roll is basically a sheet of paper with sex pheromones and glue which traps the fly. So these are perfect to be cling wrapped so they're no longer sticky, dated and kept as evidence. The traps also allow for the identification of the species that's causing the infestation. So because each of the species has its own breeding and feeding habits, it's essential that we identify and know what species we're dealing with to ensure that the most appropriate active and control program is deployed. So understanding that the lesser housefly prefers to lay eggs in semi-liquid matter allows us to place the larvicide and the adulticide in the correct place to deal with that species. 7 steps to successful fly control. So first of all, we need to monitor the situation. Monitoring should start before the infestation begins and before fly season even gets underway. We continue to monitor during fly season, and this enables us to identify spikes. It's also ideal that we record the infestations so we can refer back to them for future scenarios. Number 2 is to identify. So identification of the species of fly we're dealing with, that's going to determine the most appropriate strategy to combat the infestation. Number 3, as we see that spike, we'll deploy a larvicide. So while the temptation is to battle the adult flies head on, it only accounts for 20% of the life cycle. 80% of the problem can be dealt with using the larvicides in areas such as manure heaps, slurry pits, and straw bedding. Number 4 is to use an adulticide. So by using the baits, the sprays, the wettable powders, we're able to kill the migrating flies and those that are already present. Number 5 is to monitor. Now, while this is pretty much back to stage 1, we're now ensuring that the treatment plan has been successful. So we want to be seeing them numbers decline. 6 is to alternate. So by alternating between insecticide actives, we're preventing the insects using its natural defences to overcome these actives. Therefore, we're reducing the chance of resistance. Number 7, always follow the label. Not only does the label give advice on where it's best to use the insecticides, it's really important that the guidelines are followed for health and safety and also to maximise the effect of the product.